Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tara Needham, and I am the Assistant Academic Director at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And you are here with us at the virtual reading group. Jason Winn, who will begin our session momentarily, and will share with our group a project that emerged for him, particularly in reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. All right, Jason, I am going to invite you, please, to introduce yourself and tell us about your project.
All righty. Thank you, Tara. My name is Jason Winn. I am an architect and city planner by training. And I guess about 6 years ago, I had the inspiration to return to academia because I'd kind of run up against some hurdles that I couldn't answer easily within the industry. So I decided to go back to school to try and develop some new ideas. And those really came together around the human condition. In order to get a notion for how I wanted to use my chosen subject, which was storytelling in relation to cities, it was Arendt's research that really opened up the doors for making that happen, particularly the human condition concepts based on the three primary chapters of labor, work, and action. And I was at the same time taking an ontology course, so I started to study the boundaries between these three and found, after some trial and error, three subconditions that I was looking at as kind of a narrative infrastructure when all six of these codes are taken together. I developed the idea, I'm not trying to evolve what Arendt was talking about in relation to things like works, which are the durable tools that we use to try and preserve the human world, the built world. But the domain might be defined as where our social and our family lives are actually emplaced within that, within the world and between the labors, which of course are the what we use to make the consumable things that we need. Identity is one of the more interesting wild cards, given that it starts to talk to the social, which Arendt is very critical of, not in a negative sense, but as in critical as in judging it, because we do need to take action within our world, so otherwise we're not actually behaving as human beings. But how we actually develop meaning is developing that relationship as a acculturation between the rituals that we practice, the places where we practice them, and how we manifest ourselves as communities. So these six codes were my leap-off point for investigating a urban context that I used as my study point here on Cyprus, which is Famagusta. And I found a neighborhood association that I could coordinate with, and started researching locally based off of this very interesting urban space, which is a very international space. This it's 700-year-old environment. It's right off the coast of Lebanon and Syria, with a very defined urban boundary. As a walled city, it has a very dense, rich urban fabric that only has three ways in or out, which is a fabulous kind of microcosm. I have 1,000 residents in one small location that all have a lifetime of experience living here. Some of them have been here their whole lives. Astoundingly, the neighborhood association routinely records oral histories of the community members. And when I discovered them, bizarrely enough through Facebook, that I asked, could I have these recordings? And they said, absolutely. And we arranged to get some grant money from the local university to get some of them translated. And once we had them as transcripts, we got to do something, using a methodology of narratology, using these a priori codes that developed from the human condition. I was able to then actually code not only my literature, but the transcripts from those interviews. And that allowed the text, which, the themes could then be highlighted, and not just have the themes highlighted, but also the setting. And so I was able to map the locations of where those stories took place. These are just a list of the tools I used to do all this. And once you're able to map where the stories take place and you know what codes or what themes are relevant to those stories, then you can actually start to say, okay, well, where do these stories interact on the landscape together? And we can actually paint the urban landscape with these thematic stories. I provide them a 220-meter radius as far as area of effect being the notion of how far someone would remember something. Now, the primary uses that I'm looking at for narrative infrastructure really is to increase meaningful citizen participation. We do this by recording their maps of their actual stories. So taking what we already have is making detailed maps of sentiment. That then allows citizens to be able to then do things like jumpstart grassroots organizing. And that can also be mirrored from civil servants, like people who are legislators or administrators of the city. They would want to do pretty much the same thing, is to help communities know themselves through their stories on the landscape. But they would also probably want to test their ideas, against the local stories to see if they're thematically appropriate or if they're going to, get pushback. They also want to frame their proposals from those local contextual stories. Economic development groups or entrepreneurs, real estate developers, they would want these kinds of maps for the exact same reasons, to be able to test their proposals and also to frame their ideas from the local context. All taken together, this is what builds the world. And we are actually able to increase that meaningful citizen participation through their own stories, using their stories to develop the ideas that we would see locally. Now, there are some other secondary uses for narrative infrastructure that I'm not going to go into at length, like highlighting the competition between different cultures within the same environment, the same city, to help migrants actually engage with their local new environments, or to help scientists contextualize their research to their audience, to help historic preservation organizations be able to express not just the historic ancient stories, but the living community stories for the built fabric that they're trying to protect. And ultimately, when we start talking about urban resiliency, it's important to be able to have a sense of where people's sentiments lie after a major disaster or after a major war. So that is, in a nutshell, what narrative infrastructure looks like. I'm going to briefly show you the live version of it. I have to reshare my screen, I was told. And this is the website that we're currently running with right now. You see, this is just the Famagusta walled city. I have maybe half the stories turned on right now, and you click in any one location, and it will, if it wakes up, it will bring up the, there we go. It'll bring up the stories that are relevant to this particular pinned location. And that, is something that, whether you're a politician or whether you're just a community member, would allow you to then go in and read the stories for a particular neighborhood intersection or a house, and you would see what the competing ideas are, what the other memories are that are associated from people who are actually living there. So here in this particular location, we have looks like 5 stories all overlap in the same spot that we were able to identify as spatially being relevant to this location. In particular, these ones are coded with action, domain, and identity. So we have a variety of different perspectives for this location. Ultimately, this research was really kind of surprising when we found that the big lack in the whole of the city was, in fact, labor. And if I turn off all the other layers and we only see the labor stories, they're very, very localized. And going back through the narratives, this really hinted at a lack of stories that expressed a sense of happiness, that people don't have a lot of happy memories for the walled city, or at least this isn't the nature of the stories that they were telling to the Walled City Association. And that was the big finding in the smoking gun here for Famagusta. So that's how I've been looking at taking the ideas from Hannah Arendt to create systems that allow us to not only remember what she wrote, because she wrote an awful lot in the human condition, but also to make use of it. And using it as a code system, I use it both in my research, and I also use it for my readings. And even if I'm if I'm reading digital or paper, I still have a method of using the human condition codes. Thank you. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Jason, thank you so much. Yes, I'd like to invite, yes, it looks like, James, is your hand raised again, or is that a new hand?
Yes, it still is up.
Okay, would you like to ask Jason a question?
I got about 5 questions. Is that okay, Jason?
Sure.
Is your direction market-based or is it commons-based?
The approach is meant to be multifaceted so that it can it will garner support from both is the intention.
Is your commons thinking rigorous, or is it loosey-goosey to allow for market-based?
It is got the ethical backbone for the social base, and with encryption and so on and so forth. And that the most important part is that the narratives that are presented, the stories that are presented, are authentic, so that they're not being manipulated. Within that realm, I can definitely have foresee the idea of this being useful to developers, because everything we do in a city is a story. Absolutely every part of the city is a story. Everything in your room started off once as a story. And developers are playing that game all the time, and usually pretty badly. So if we can give them local context, if we can give them local stories, they can take those on board and actually write the next chapter for the location, and with an understanding of the chapters that came before.
Is the best way to reach you at the website that was on the page?
Yeah, narrativeinfrastructure.org. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. And are you familiar with the work of Eleanor Ostrom in commonings?
That's a new one for me, Ostrom.
There's a really great book, Free, Fair, and Alive, on commoning that might be of interest to you and your thinking in the future.
Thank you. Got that.
Would you call yourself urban? Would you call what you're doing urban planning?
Yeah. This is an urban planning and an urban design tool.
Would you call yourself a new urbanist?
No, I would not.
No, you're not. You wouldn't go with that in that direction.
No, I find that they're a little too idealistic, and they tend to be more systems oriented as opposed to public oriented. So they kind of tend to dictate rather than listen. And that's the exact opposite of what I'm trying to propose, is that we should spend all of our time listening, and that cities should be evolving from the communities as opposed to big grand ideas. That it's the small ideas and the small world environments that are the most important thing. One of the best thinkers on this passed away yesterday, Christopher Alexander. He had some amazing, he had some really programmatic ideas, but he also had a lot of ideas that are called generative architecture, which is about developing from the seed and from the environment and then responding as opposed to dictating.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm gonna ask if we can let someone else. We have 3 people with more questions. Thank you, James. Maybe you can also contact Jason directly. Stephen, the first Stephen.
Thank you. First time I've been first at anything for quite a while. Jason, I applaud the effort entirely. Here in my town, we're having a battle with developers at all stages and phases, and I'm wondering what the uptake really will be of very good narratives if there isn't a willing listener on the part of the developers. Here in my area, developers have carte blanche. Cities and planners seem to just roll over every time a confrontation comes up. So I'm wondering if narratives might be a necessary condition, but possibly not a sufficient condition for the kinds of things that you and I might want. Thanks.
The truth is, within the realm of city planning and within the realm of city management, politics is still the rule. and the best story always wins. Sometimes there is a bias that is built in or baked in that can still be broken down on a narrative basis using the media and non-governmental organizations. When you speak with the ethos of the community, you literally cannot be spoken down, and that one strength is what makes stories so eminently powerful. And in fact, it's why they're actually in charge. And when you look at power disparities, then you need to address the narrative directly to that and use Aristotle's techniques of developing stories, use storytellers' techniques of getting the actual characters and actually proposing them, use sensory cues to invoke people. Honestly, the school of rhetoric, we poo-poo from the perspective of, the philosophical school. Plato always spoke ill of the rhetors. And the fact is that school actually is very strong and is foundational to acting in politics. Storytelling is non-negotiable. You have to, and the better you can do it, the more that you can leverage the ethos of the community, the honest and reported knowledge of the community, you'll always have a stronger argument over and over and over. Now, you may not be able to argue directly against the developers, but you can against the regulators.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Stephen Most, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. And before my question, I must say that I didn't know that Christopher Alexander died. I made a film about him called Places for the Soul, the director Ruth Landy. And also there's a chapter about him in my book, Stories Make the World, reflections on storytelling and the art of the documentary. There's also a chapter about Hannah Arendt, with whom I studied in Chicago. So if you want to see this film about Christopher Alexander, use my name, Stephen Most /stories, and you'll be able to see Places for the Soul.
Awesome.
It's quite a remarkable film, critical of Christopher Alexander, but also showing his great strengths. So the question I have is, I want to know how these stories are manifest in this community. Now, evidently they were spoken, you got transcripts, you started coding the transcripts, but were they recorded in one-on-one sessions? Were they spoken in public? I think that makes a huge difference within a community, whether there is a space in which people can speak to others and tell their stories.
These particular narratives that I started with were recorded in the chambers with the rest of the NGO, the non-governmental organization Masdar. So it's kind of like a community discussion. The approach for Cypriots to discuss and discourse is more kind of like a congenial argument. So while there may be someone actually telling their story up front, the audience will be filling in other facts the whole time. So honestly, the transcription was a real challenge. We had transcribers working out of Istanbul who were almost ready to burn the whole project to the ground because it was such a different arrangement. A direct one-on-one oral history is definitely going to be a lot more effective way to pull this kind of data set together. But it was useful to be able to demonstrate that even under less than ideal conditions, we can still identify the settings and then ultimately the themes that relate to those settings. And also the time. So there's the big realization was that stories are very qualitative, and qualitative should be running our cities. But why and where does any one particular voice belong somewhere? Except that stories include the setting. And that's not qualitative. That's quantitative. So we can use that.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to take one last question from Bob Meyerson.
Hi, Jason. In your schematic of Arendt's human condition, you use the word works with an S. She used the word work. And I think the difference is works suggest the product or the result, whereas work suggests the actual activity. So was that simply a slip of the keyboard, or was that deliberate?
This is the kind of question I was hoping to get tonight, I'll be perfectly honest. A critical question about the codes is near and dear. When I think about works, of course, I was performing a Master's of Science in Urban Design. So for the sake of what I was trying to communicate to my professors, to the Hojas, was to talk about the urban context. So that being said, it was much more appropriate to talk about the works in the perspective of an infrastructure. And my ultimate proposal was to say stories are an infrastructure. We just don't understand them correctly that way. So I was building a bridge backwards from what the professors already knew, which is the works as in the plumbing, the sewers, the electrical, the et cetera, all of our typical infrastructure, our core infrastructure, and to then roll that back and say, but what's even more foundational to this than that is in fact the stories that underlie all that.
We had one more question in the chat that I just wanted to bring to your attention that Maria asks, I'm not sure I understand why settings are classified as quantitative. Could Jason please elaborate more on that, please?
Sure. When we look at a story as a hermetic thing, as a sealed thing, the sentiment is the qualitative. It's the qualities that the individuals bring forward. But the settings are actual locations. And so when me as a planner am given a setting, I actually have a location, which is a latitude and a longitude. That's a very quantitative element, literally, because I can give it some zeros and some ones and numbers that I can actually locate it to a particular spot on the planet. And that's why stories have always been it was actually kind of the fun thing of telling my work that I'm leaving to go take a master's degree in storytelling, because I knew they would all giggle at that. I thought, oh, thank goodness, at least they won't quit. They'll think I went crazy, which is perfect. But that realization, Maria, that there is in fact a way to locate stories, because they do have setting and they do have time, means that we can locate them at a particular place and a particular time. And then we can overlay them with other typical maps that we use for urban management.
Okay, thank you. I was just a little bit confused, because you could also argue that that settings are very qualitative, particularly if you think of how you describe a setting, right, ethnographically. I'm an anthropologist, so that's why I was a little bit, Thank you for clarifying. That makes a lot of sense.
So clearly there is tremendous interest in Jason's project, and with good reason. And I know for myself, it's with Jason's project and with Ken's maps, that it's very exciting to see how Arendt's work is manifesting or influencing or kind of impacting the world, and also our thought and our actions, and just how we are kind of creating our world. So Jason, I want to thank you. I have a feeling that we could probably bring you back another time and just have a full hour with you. And so, or whatever. So that's certainly open to a possibility, and people can communicate for sure if they'd like to have more time on your project. So
thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Okay.